a large part of it starts with the way that we see the world. There is so much around us every day that we take for granted. We're just going about our business. But I love that even Jesus himself in the Gospels, he called us to a life of contemplation when he said things like, consider the lilies, consider the ravens. You know, he was calling our attention to these things all around us that were full of wonder, that were full of spiritual encounter, that were full of art, you know? And so that's a practice that I put in my own life, a practice of observation, a practice of attentiveness, and really just tuning my eyes to see the world differently. I mean, that's essentially what an artist does, is he or she helps us to see the world through new eyes.
You're listening to the Ferment Podcast, conversations about worship and transformation. Today's guest is Stephen Roach. Stephen is the host of the Makers and Mystics podcast and the founder of the Breath and the Clay Creative Arts Movement, an international community of artists and creatives.
This episode is brought to you by our friends at worshipteam.com. Worshipteam.com comes preloaded with over 12,000 songs, with new songs being added all the time. Hillsong, Bethel, Vineyard, Six Steps, Jesus Culture, just to name a few. Service building with Worship Team is a snap, and all the songs are completely legal and licensed. You can also find them on social media, Facebook at worshipteam.com, Twitter at worshipteam, Instagram at worshipteam_WT. Visit them at worshipteam.com for a free trial today. Complete worship planning with thousands of songs, easy interface, mobile apps, and legal rights for your church. All you need in one place, worshipteam.com.
Hey, Stephen, welcome to the Ferment Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
Hey, I am really excited you're here because, well, we always, at least on this podcast, we oftentimes talk to songwriters and musicians. That's not uncommon. We talk to a lot of worship leaders, and you definitely have feet in those arenas. You have history there, but you do a lot more than that. You're a podcaster, you're a musician, you've written poetry, and you throw this really big art conference called Breath and Clay. I'm just interested in how you think of yourself, I guess, like in terms of your vocation. Could you talk to us about that? Because you're one of these guys who has a lot of things going.
Sure.
Yeah.
You know, I think that ultimately I'm just someone who's hopelessly curious. And, I think whether I'm writing music or poetry or bringing people together, I think underneath all of that is just this curiosity to discover wonder and really explore some things that maybe you've overlooked. I jokingly tell people that I was condemned to be a musician from the beginning.
What do you mean by that? What do you mean by that?
Well, my mom was one of 15 kids. They were all bluegrass pick and sharecroppers.
Wow. Okay.
And then my dad was a third generation Appalachian fiddle player. And so music was kind of baked in from the beginning with me.
Okay. So that means you not only have tons of aunts and uncles, does that mean you have tons of cousins as well?
I still meet cousins that I've never met before.
That's hilarious. Only in the South, right?
Only in the South, exactly.
Okay. So is all of your family bluegrass musicians? Is that kind
Most
of the
everybody.
thing? Okay.
Yeah, it really is. And I mean, but for me, and of course you would know this from some of my musical background, but for me, that ventured off into more world music and ethnomusicology and things like that.
Yeah, can you just talk to us about that? Because I know some of the music that you've made over the years, and you're right, it is like world music. I know that you play a lot of different kinds of drums and things. I've seen you do that. Mm-hmm. Where did that interest come from?
Yeah. I'm still trying to figure that one out. You know, I often laugh that I was born into a bluegrass family, but I came out playing Arabic and West African percussion. So go figure, you know?
That's amazing. That's so amazing.
But, but really, when you get to the heart of bluegrass music, even though we think of it as a traditional American music, it's really world music at the base. You've got the banjo from Africa, the mandolin from Italy, the guitar from Europe, and the fiddle from Ireland. And you bring all those together. And so again, that goes back to that curiosity, that experimentation that I mentioned earlier. It's really just about bringing things together that to share a common context that maybe they didn't share before.
That's right. And even bluegrass melodies, they are oddly Irish in a way, you know?
Very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can feel the blood in it for sure.
That's good. Well, I love that. I love that you are someone who's curious and you've done just tons of different kinds of things. I'm interested maybe a little bit more in personal history, because I would imagine that a lot of people who are listening to this podcast don't really know who you are or where you're from or what it is you're doing. So could you just tell us a little bit more? Like, I'm assuming you grew up in Carolina. Tell us where you grew up. What was your family like? Were you a family of faith? That kind of stuff.
Sure. I'm actually writing a memoir about all of that to answer that question a little better. But I guess the simple version is I did grow up in North Carolina. This has always been home for me. A little rural tobacco town nobody's ever heard of on the Virginia border. As far as family of faith, I didn't grow up in the church. My mom was always a strong believer. My dad was just a bluegrass musician that toured around and played bluegrass. But yeah, I've always had this creative background. I think in that city where I grew up, there was really nothing to do except work or get in trouble. And
Yeah.
And so, so we found ourselves hanging out in abandoned houses, under bridges, train tracks, just we had to make everything that we had. And so I think for me, it taught me how to be creative. It taught me to find wonder in the mundane. It taught me how to find art within the ordinary. And I think that's just always stuck with me, whether that's been in the music that I've done or in the art that I've made, the poetry that I write. So yeah, that's a little bit of where I came from.
I get small town life. I mean, I'm in Campbellsville, Kentucky right now, which is...
Oh, yeah.
I mean, on its best day, it's 11,000 people, right? And there's only 25,000 in the county. When I was growing up, I thought it was maybe a bit of a curse because there was, quote, nothing to do. As I've gotten older, I've realized there's a gift inside of it, and it's that it forces you, to use your words, it forces you to make things,
Totally.
You know,
Absolutely.
There's really not great places to go eat, so you might want to become a good cook.
Absolutely.
There's not a ton of entertainment, and you might want to play guitar. And it's, oddly enough, even here in our city, I think it's been part of the seedbed of a culture of creativity that is somewhat unusual, and I think that's pretty normal in a lot of southern small towns.
Right.
Just limited options.
Absolutely.
It forces something, right?
It's true.
Yeah. Okay. So can you talk to me about your journey of faith? If your mom was a stronger believer and your dad's kind of like out on the road, what was Jesus to you growing up? And then when did it become personal?
Yeah, sure. Well, I actually had some pretty intense encounters with Jesus when I was young, about 10 years old. And that tied into music as well. I think I ended up with my sister at a Christian concert somewhere, and they, did like an altar call or something. But I had a genuine encounter, and I didn't even know how to spell church at that point. I just walked into a concert and walked out and had this really radical encounter, but I didn't have the grounding for it. So by the time I was a teenager, I had really started exploring a lot of other spiritual paths. I got into a lot of darker spiritual things, a lot of Native American spirituality as well. I searched everywhere, I found myself leading drum circles at Grateful Dead concerts and just...
Hilarious. Did you follow the Dead for a while?
I think the Dead followed me for a while,
Too good.
Yeah.
Duly noted.
So anyway, that's kind of... so I have a very variegated spiritual background, but... interesting enough, when I was in my early 20s, I had another encounter that kind of brought me back home, and I just realized that, I didn't even know what to call God. So I called him the Great Spirit. Native Americans called him the Great Spirit. So I said, this will work. I said, God, Great Spirit, show me who you are. And I laughingly tell people that Jesus was the only one that responded. So
amazing.
And since then, I've been walking with Jesus probably for over 20 years at this point.
I love that story. Great Spirit, tell me who you are. That's beautiful.
That's right.
That's really beautiful. Stephen, could you share with us, maybe just as an entry point into the deeper aspects of your work, could you just tell us a little bit about what you consider to be your life message?
Absolutely.
Like, why are you here? I'm just very interested in people who do the things you do.
Sure. Absolutely. Well, for me, this goes back to my faith, and I think inherently that God created us to be creative beings, as he is a creative being. And so I think part of what makes us fully human is to live out of our creative nature. And I tend to think that creativity reaches its peak when it comes from a place of communion with God. So for me, my faith and my art are one and the same. Creativity is spiritual in nature, and I think healthy spirituality will always be expressed creatively, you know? So for me, that's kind of the MO of all that I'm doing these days with the Makers and Mystics podcast, with the Breath in the Clay creative arts events, is really bringing to light the relationship between art and faith and why that's important to us as human beings, not just if you identify as an artist, but just as a human being, why those things are important.
Well, one of the things I love about the book of Genesis in particular is, well, two things in particular, just kind of like riffing off of what you're talking about here. One, the first revelation of who God is creator. You know, before he ever reveals himself as Savior, Father, you know, the things that we classically click the box on, he reveals himself as creator. And then secondly, it says that he makes man and woman in his image. And the only context for what his image might be at that point is creativity, right? So
Totally.
You know, when people talk about the divine image that is inherent in all people, it has to be our capacity to dream a thing that isn't and bring it into the present or into existence, right? So
exactly.
I love that you're creating or wanting to make spaces where this conversation of faith and art can really have its appropriate place, which is together. That's what I hear you saying. I hear you saying it has to go together.
It is. And I think, you know, ultimately, and some people that I talk to, they're like, well, I don't think I'm one of those creative types, or I'm not, you know, I don't consider myself an artist. And so they get a little antsy about coming to some of the events we do. But then when they come, they realize that it's awakened the creativity inside of them that was there that maybe they didn't recognize.
Well, and how many times do you think people sort of take that approach of, I don't consider myself an artist, when really what they're saying is we, and by we, I just mean whoever, culture at large, has sort of defined art so narrowly.
Absolutely.
We've over-narrowed whatever that category is.
Yeah.
I mean, I have a CPA. You know, I have a CPA who helps me with my taxes. He's very creative, and that doesn't mean he's like cheating. He's understanding in a really wonderful way what it is I do and how to serve me. And it's beautiful.
Well, you can give me his phone number. I'd like his creativity in my life.
That's right. Amen.
Yeah. I love what one of my favorite authors is Abraham Joshua Heschel.
Oh, yeah, man. The ineffable.
You know,
absolutely. Come on with that.
Yeah. And he just says this thing, above all, be sure that you make your life a work of art, you know.
Amen.
And so I think regardless of whether we're the CPA or the plumber or the artist or the worship leader or whatever it may be, that we live our lives as if we are the art that I think we've been created to be.
Amen. Stephen, can you maybe, like lots of people are listening and they're probably loving a lot of what you're saying, but maybe they don't know where to start. Where can we start, like engaging the creativity that God has put inside of us or made us to reflect or create? How can we engage it? Where does creativity come from? How do we get in the flow?
You know, I think a large part of it starts with the way that we see the world. There is so much around us every day that we take for granted. We're just going about our business and we bypass the things, you know, but I love that even Jesus himself in the Gospels, he called us to a life of contemplation when he said things like, consider the lilies, consider the ravens. You know, he was calling our attention to these things all around us that were full of wonder, that were full of spiritual encounter, that were full of art, you know? And so that's a practice that I put in my own life, is a practice of observation, a practice of attentiveness, and really just tuning my eyes to see the world differently. I mean, that's essentially what an artist does, is he or she helps us to see the world through new eyes. And I think that's something that we can all learn to do.
Yeah, that word consider is kind of important, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Because you're right. It's really easy. Like my wife and I, we have 4 kids and we love them a lot. And it's really easy to just wake up and get into the routine of like taking kids to school and making sure we're hitting soccer practice and making sure the spelling tests are studied or whatever, and then we just sort of miss all these little beautiful moments that maybe happen in the day that could either wake our hearts up more or continue to keep us asleep.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. That makes so much sense.
Yeah, life has a way of either being anesthesia to us or waking us up a little bit. Yeah, love that word, consider. Yeah, Stephen, can you talk to me just for a minute about maybe what the church could do to make more space for artists and creatives? What could we do? Like, I mean, this is probably going to drill down into the bedrock of like values and things, but just, challenge us here a little bit.
Totally. This is a big one for me, man. And, and I'll start by saying that I'm not jaded toward the church. I don't have a burr in my saddle. I don't have an axe to grind here. So for the listeners that are actively part of a church community, I'm not coming from that place. And I think that's important to say first, because as a part of the community of faith, I think there is a level of critique that we can offer without seeking to tear it down, So that said, I think first it would really help us if we could learn to be okay with mystery. And I think that, following Jesus doesn't mean that we have to have all the answers, and that admitting that some things remain mystery doesn't diminish God's glory. The reason I bring that up is because art is more often about asking questions than it is about giving all the answers. And I think that sometimes the church has wanted the artist to give all the answers, sometimes that can kill the creative process. So I think that if we could learn to not be so fearful of those that think or believe differently than ourselves, and if we could approach life with those eyes that we were talking about earlier, with this expectation of discovering something new understanding of God, rather than acting in defense or fear or trepidation, I think it starts there. But then I think practically speaking, there's no way that the full scope of the creative experience can ever fit into the hour and a half of Sunday morning. It's just not going to happen. That can't be the pinnacle of our aspiration as artists and creatives, is to fit into that Sunday morning model. And so I think that learning to see the inherent value in art, apart from whether it serves the agenda of the church or not, is a real key.
Well, I know a lot of times, I'll just put my pastor hat back on right now. I wear a lot of different hats, but one of them's pastor. If I'm being honest, I think one of the things that I would need to confess, and I think I can confess this for a lot of pastors, is sometimes as pastors, we just get into the mode of only seeing people for what they bring to a Sunday morning. Right? Like we see maybe someone's talents, and then we only can imagine them. Our imagination is so limited by what you said a moment ago, the hour and a half that is Sunday morning or whatever.
Right.
And that's just, inappropriate would be one word maybe to use, but it's limiting. And I think one of the things I'm hearing that in terms of, as a pastor, is I'm hearing the challenge to see people for who they really are, and maybe make some space to just let them be whatever it is they are, even if what they are doing shows up more on Friday or a Monday, whatever that is.
Absolutely. Yeah. For sure.
Any other ways that we can drill into making space for artists?
I think that we'll make space for what we put value on, and I think you were talking about Genesis 1 earlier. So if we can go back to that, and if we can learn to see that creativity is a part of what it means to be human, then we can start valuing it as a reflection of the nature of God. And I think the same thing with something like environmentalism. If we see the environment as God's work of art, then the way we approach it should be with a little bit of reverence. We can approach those things differently, And so I think that when we understand that there is an inherent value on art and creativity that is a reflection of the image of God, we can begin to approach those things differently, because when we do, we'll end up encountering him in a whole new way than maybe we've ever experienced.
When we first started talking about this just a moment ago, one of the first words that came out of your mouth was critique. Yeah, can you talk to me about that for a minute? Because when I hear the word critique, maybe this is just me, but it sort of made me think of Old Testament prophets, some of whom would probably need to go into the performance artist category.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Can you just talk to me
Absolutely.
can you talk to me about art as critique and maybe even as like Christian artist as critiquer,
Yeah.
but not terror downer, if I can say it so
Right.
sluggishly there. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because earlier we were even talking about the mundane and the ordinary, and we're just doing our day to day. We've got kids to get to school. We've got all these things. I think the same thing happens in the life of the church. We have these things that have to get done. We get in our routines, and then our routines become ruts, and then we just do what worked before because we're tired, and we just keep going. But I think the role of the artist, much like some of those Old Testament prophets you mentioned, whether it's Ezekiel who laid on his side, who made a model of the city of Jerusalem, cooked his food over manure, and just did this weird, probably not beautiful to behold act,
Yeah, that it's so hysterical because there's a sense in which, as church people, you read the story of Ezekiel and you just read it with stained glass eyes, right? You're just like, well, yes, he cooks his food over manure. He makes models. He's laying on his side for a really long time. That's normal. But really, it would be odd, right?
Right.
And this is how he's communicating the word of God back to the people of God. That's what's amazing.
Yeah, it is. And we forget that was a God-sanctioned performance art act that Ezekiel did. The same thing with Jeremiah, the same thing with Isaiah. All those prophets were engaged in the arts. I mean, God spoke to Jeremiah and said, I'm going to speak to you, but I want you to go watch the potter on the wheel, and that's where you're going to hear my voice. So anyway, I think love really is the criteria for any critique, and so I think that as artists, we can be full of hope without being naive or without being blind to the things that are in front of us. And I think that when we come at this with a heart of love, we can offer critique because there needs to be critique. Let's be honest, a lot of the things that worked in the past don't work for us right now. So in my view, creativity really is what is needed for the church at large right now. And we need to listen to the voice of the artist, both in the church and in culture, because you'll see the barometer of where humanity is right now when you look at the visions that the artists are giving to us.
Hello, everyone. Adam here. Wanted to break into our conversation really quickly just to remind you of our Sing Together conference that's happening this March 26, 27, and 28 in Nashville, Tennessee. It is the first national worship conference that we have hosted in the Vineyard for over 20 years, and for that reason, we are really, really excited. It's always great to have everybody in the room at the same time. I found that special things happen when we're all together. Anyhow, some of our best friends are going to be there. Eleanor Mumford is coming to speak to us. Dee Wilson from Common Hymnal is going to be there. I'm going to be there. And then we have some other friends that we're going to release here in a few weeks who are joining us as well. We're getting all the details settled. And the thing for you to do today is to sign up because space is very limited. Lots of people have already registered, and that limited space has become even more limited. So why not go on to vineyardworship.com today and sign up, because I would really, really love to have you in the room. All right. Peace. Yeah, a lot of times artists and musicians are kind of the canaries in the coal mine. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've done this, but have you ever seen the art that was coming out of Germany like a decade or decade and a half before World War II? It's all telling the story of what was going to happen in some ways. And I would use the word prophetic there, but not in the highly charismatic sense. It's something more, something. It's like they were reverberating with the story of culture, and they're kind of like putting it up, and those images, they came out as real,
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So I'm hearing you talk and I'm thinking, gosh, one way that maybe, or one great thing that can come out of making space for artists and creatives is that we can hear the spirit for what's coming, or we can begin to hopefully offer a new narrative. I think that's the hope that's inside of real critique. Yeah.
Yes. Walter Brueggemann is one of my favorite thinkers. He had a book called The Prophetic Imagination.
Dude, that book ruined my life. I just got to jump in here. When I read that, and when he started riffing on Solomon and how Solomon is just another Pharaoh, I was like, I'm not a Christian. I've never read the Bible right. I know nothing.
Right.
Gold stars.
It's so true.
Yeah, but
it's
go
so
ahead.
True.
What were you going to say about Brueggemann? I just cut you off. I'm sorry.
Well, anytime we talk about cultural critique, and the imagination and creativity, he comes to mind immediately for me.
Yeah, same. Same.
Yeah.
Well, hey, listen, if you're listening to the podcast and you're wondering, like, what should I read next? Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann.
Just expect to dive into that for about a year.
That's
Don't
right.
read it fast.
Don't, just paragraph at a time. It's good. All right, Stephen, hey, tell me about some of your heroes.
Yeah. Well,
who
we've talked about some of them.
Yeah, I'd love to know.
Sure. Well, this morning I was listening to Niels Fromm, and he's an avant-garde composer whose music I absolutely adore, Niels Fromm. And I was so bummed because last year, right on the opening night of The Breath in the Clay, he was performing an hour away from where we were doing the event.
Breaking your
Niels
heart.
Fromm, yeah, it was. But then as far as writers and spiritual thinkers, of course, I love Thomas Merton. Thomas Merton has been a tremendous influence on me. I also love Dorothy Sayers.
Yeah.
But one good way, and this is a little bit of a plug, admittedly, but on the Makers and Mystics podcast, we do an artist profile series where I do just 10-minute expository biographies on different artists or spiritual thinkers in history. And most of those that I do those expositions on are my heroes, and it has everybody from Hans Ruckmacher, who is an incredible scholar and art thinker, to I did one on the spiritual life of Andy Warhol, and just lots of different figures like that. But yeah, I mean, the first ones that come to mind, of course, are Thomas Merton. I love John O'Donohue, Dorothy Sayers. Those are some of the people that inspire me.
I'm particularly interested in Merton, maybe just because he spent his life only about 35 miles from where I'm at right now.
Yes.
Yeah. What'd you pick up from Thomas Merton?
I think at the core, he was a poet and an artist. And I think that's why I resonate with him so deeply is if you read his autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, you find out that he was an artist. He was the son of an artist, traveled all over Europe, for a long time with his parents who were just these wild artists. But then his poetry came out way before his doctrinal teachings or his New Seeds of Contemplation books. And so I think for me, I resonate with that because I came to faith much later in my life, really. I began as an artist. I began as a poet. As I said earlier, one hopelessly curious about everything. And then the faith component came into that. And so when I think about Thomas Merton, I really resonate with the way art and faith worked in his life.
Yeah, what's really cool is his abbot was the one who really pressed him to keep writing. Even though...
That's right, yeah.
Even though in some ways, the fraternity, the brotherhood, the monastery that he's a part of is, deeply connected to ideas of plantedness, like geographic plantedness, life of simplicity, humility. Don't make a big thing about yourself. Just live your life before the eye of God, kind of idea, But his abbot realized that the gifts of poetry and prose that he had were significant, and they weren't just for him; they were for the world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And part of what I love about the Merton story as well, and connected to that, is just how a lot of times as artists, we really do need someone else to see us and to believe in us and to affirm us.
Absolutely.
That's one of the things that really came through for me when I was reading Seven-Story Mountain and some of the other things that Thomas had written.
I want to tag on that because it really goes into some of the foundational beliefs of why I do what I do concerning the creative arts community that we're building and the Breath in the Clay events, is that I've kind of identified three needs within the heart of the artist, and I really think within the heart of humanity. But one is the need to belong, One is the need to be known, and then the other is the need to make a significant contribution. And even when you go back to your question about what can the church do to help facilitate this, that would be my simple answer, is to foster that need to belong, to foster the need to be known without judgment or criticism or scowl, and then to give a place to make a significant contribution in whatever way that looks. But those three things, I believe, are at the heart of every artist.
I especially love that you put number 3 in there, because of the 3, that one is the one that seems the most, I wouldn't say, I guess, surprising in some ways, especially since we're thinking in terms of the church and whatnot, because the truth is people really do have greatness inside of them, or a desire for greatness. And, that's a wild thing, but, you can't get rid of that desire to do something significant, whatever that is. I just love that you're articulating it like that. People need permission to do great things.
Absolutely, for sure. And maybe this is a little bit of a rabbit trail, but I don't think so. But I think a lot of times, and this is important, don't get me wrong, but we talk so much about having our identity in Christ and not letting the things that we do identify us. We can sometimes forget that the things that we do are meant to be an outflow of who we are. And so I think you can't call artists into the church and then tie their hands when they get there. Amen. It's like there has to be room for identity formation in the Spirit, but then as an outflow, the works that we do will reflect the heart that they come from.
Amen. Yeah, and recently I've been falling more and more in love with the word vocation because of that. Because vocation holds some holy space inside of it.
Yes.
The work that you were made to do, the voice that you heard calling to you that you had to respond to,
So good.
Yeah, man. Yeah. Hey, here's another question I'd love for you to riff on. And it has to do with art and artists as well. But I would love for you to talk a little bit about why you think so many, and I'm talking about culture-shaping artists, artists that we've seen in books, artists that we've gone to the museum and seen. Why are so many artists that have shaped culture, why do they live and why do they make art outside of the faith space?
How long is this podcast?
Dude, it can be as long as we want it to be. This is my show.
That's right. Oh, man, such good questions. I know in my own life, I've always been more interested in participating in the larger cultural conversation than I am just staying among those that believe the same thing as me. I love the challenge. I love the friction. I love getting into the mix, I get antsy if I feel like I'm in an echo chamber where people are just relaying the same things that I already know or believe. I've said many times that many of my atheist friends have made me a much better believer in Jesus than some Sunday sermons that I've listened to, But I think also that this kind of goes back to my previous thought that, artists by nature, I think, are explorers. And in our faith communities, sometimes we feel safe when we have everything figured out. But artists are hardwired to go beyond status quo, to push past what's already been said or done. And I'm not saying that there aren't absolutes or that there aren't certain beliefs that act as anchors for our lives. Of course there are, But I think our absolutes can be windows instead of walls.
I love that. That's a great way to say it. Windows instead of walls. Something that leads our vision out a little further.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And so I think that sometimes the artist can feel a bit confined within religious settings because everything is kind of neat and figured out, and it restricts our ability to interact with possibility or to explore alternative solutions, alternative endings to things, or to look at things from a different angle. And, art is all about exploring the possibilities. And unfortunately, I think sometimes there can be, whether they're perceived or real, there can be religious expectations placed upon the artist to perceive the world in a particular way. And that often creates discord in the heart of the artist because we're not made that way, Maybe that's part of it, or maybe it's not quite so philosophical?
No, I actually appreciate the philosophical part because I think it's digging down into something a bit more true. I know for me, and I think this is true about, people in general, you use the word explorer, and I just think there's something inside of people when it comes to faith, when it comes to art, just life in general. I think we need the space to have our own journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
I talk about it pretty often on this podcast. People are probably kind of sick of hearing it, but I just think it's true. Like one of the most consistent metaphors in the whole Bible is the idea of journey. Like everyone in the whole book is always walking somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for artists, just to reflect, I think what I'm hearing you say, a lot of times they do move outside the church because sometimes in the church, it just feels like everything's figured out,
Right.
And now it's, well, that's, okay, what am I supposed to do? Where's the room for my contribution, or how can I have my own exploration? And, I just agree, there's got to be something that gives people some room to explore and to wiggle.
Mm-hmm. I think if we could allow people to be in process, like you're saying, it's a journey, it's a walk. If we allow people to be in process, I think we'll create more space for the artist.
Yeah, that's good. It's really good. One of the, the main questions that I've been wrestling with for a few years is in this domain. It has maybe less to do with the idea of art in particular, more just in the idea of processing faith and faith communities. But, I've been thinking for a while about, like, how can we have a faith expression that is orthodox, that is rooted in the creeds, but still flexible enough that my children can go have their own journey with God, whatever that is, they can keep going.
Yeah.
One of my good friends, Sam Yoder, who's a musician as well, and Sam's supremely interested in the idea of exploration, and he made kind of a really great space record here recently. But there's just something inside the human heart. Like when we feel like there's an open vista in front of us, we come alive. When it feels like everything has been settled, we become less than ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For sure. And that can quench the creative spirit sometimes.
Oh, I think it kills it. I think you nailed it. Yeah. All right. Talk to me a little bit about the Jesus story and how that maybe interacts with your art.
Sure.
I know you said you've been walking with Jesus for a couple decades after you quit the drum circle at the Dead. It's the funniest thing in the world. I love that. But as an artist who's kept on producing things and making things and living things out, what part of the Jesus story informs your work these days?
Yeah. I tell people that one of my favorite attributes of God is his mischief. And we don't often talk about that when we label the attributes of God. But when you think about stories like Emmaus Road, you can't help but see the mischief of God, But then also some of my favorite scriptures are, for instance, in the Gospel of Mark, when it says that Jesus appeared to them in a different form. I'm always struck by what that actually means, that Jesus appeared to them in a different form. What did that mean,
Yeah.
Because I think we can encounter God in the simplest of daily experiences. The mundane can become art, all things that we've talked about. But that part of the Jesus story always impacts me, that he's always showing up in a way that we don't expect. He's always hanging out with the wrong people. He's always going to the places that the religious community didn't even assume was healthy or kosher for him to be at, always accusing him of being a drunk and a heretic.
Yeah.
But I think I'm most impacted by the invitational nature of Jesus. It's like there's such an invitation there he incites us to partake in his infinite goodness in so many ways. And that part of it really resonates with me.
Yeah, when you read the Gospels, Jesus is always inviting people.
Yes.
Yeah, come and see.
Yes.
Follow me. Yeah, it's
my favorite.
It's the best.
That's how I got here.
It is. There's actually some really quiet brilliance in there,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's funny how much less compelling, and I'm using air quotes here, here's everything you need to know, versus come and see. Come and find out. Yeah, that's just much more compelling.
Yes.
As a person and even as an artist. All right, let's talk about maybe some ways that, and we've done this a little bit, but maybe we could drill into something a little more specific here. Stephen, can you talk to me about a few ways that liturgy and art might interact? Or we might say it this way, liturgy and beauty. I'm just even thinking of, our regular Sunday morning services. Where are the places where those things might intersect a little bit?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. My visual art friends like to remind me that visual art was in the temple long before music showed up.
Duly noted.
Yeah. Right. They're always quick to remind me of that. But I think that we have to remember that the Word became flesh, that the invisible became visible. I love John O'Donohue says that the invisible hungers to become visible, and I think that if we can redeem our view, we have the word sensual is usually negative, but if we use sensory, maybe that'll help us a little bit. But that the arts and the senses, these things are incarnational. They're inherently good, and were created as ways for us to encounter God. And so I think that if we can make space for art and for beauty and for music and for taste and all the senses to become part of our worship experience, I think it'll only enrich our experience of God. And I think part of that's because, art of any brand, whether it's visual art or music or whatever it is, it reaches to touch something bigger, something beyond itself, something beyond ourselves. And so for me as a follower of Jesus, I think that, that's reaching toward God. And so I think that when we bring liturgy and worship or our spiritual practice into communion with the art that we make, we're going to have an experience of that union between heaven and earth, between the invisible and the visible, And so that's my encouragement, is to bring art into our worship, not just, music. Music has had the corner on the market for the past,
Yeah. 500 years.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And I've heard some people that were making a critique that maybe said that the church is being propped up by music right now. And that's a whole different conversation. But
I don't think they're totally wrong.
Right.
Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
Yeah. But what if music was not the pinnacle of our worship experience, but what if it was just the foundation? And now that we've laid a pretty strong foundation with music, what if we began to add visual art and film and liturgy, choreography and these things to our worship experience? I think we haven't even scratched the surface of how those things can come together.
What I think I hear you saying is take the story and flesh it out, because you kept using the word incarnational. Right?
Yes.
So take the story, flesh it out. And I kind of love that because it recenters back on, at least in a historic sense, the center of the church gathering has always been bread and wine.
Mm-hmm.
Two fleshed out elements to tell the Jesus story. Yeah. But then I'm wondering if those elements aren't in some ways also a permission to say, well, how else could we tell the story?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe it's with paint. Maybe it's with movement. Maybe it's with singing, or how we actually arrange our buildings,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think so.
Yeah. Listen, and I'm coming from a church that is a warehouse, but man, one of the biggest disappointments in the world right now is that all the modern churches, we're all just in warehouses,
That's so true.
Lord help us. Please.
That's so true.
Yeah. That's wonderful. All right. Hey, Stephen, let's do some quick hitters here real quick before we wrap. Is that cool?
Sounds good.
All right, quick hitters. Number one, country or city?
Country or city? Oh, I love the woods.
All right, country. Books or movies?
No, books. Yeah.
Duke or North Carolina?
I hate it all.
I love it. Polarization. I love it. All right. Last one. Stones or Beatles?
Ooh. You had to throw that one in there. That depends on the mood. If my Enneagram 4 is coming out, then probably Beatles. If the Enneagram 5 is coming out, probably the Stones. I don't know.
Nice. Nicely done. All right. Hey, let's wrap with one more question. But before we do that, I know that you have your Breath and Clay conference coming up. Can you just give a quick pitch and tell people like when it is and where it is and what it's about? Maybe they want to come.
Sure thing. So it takes place in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. The dates are March 20th through the 22nd. And it is an international gathering of artists and creatives. This year, just off the top of my head, there are many more presenters than this, but we've got Cageless Birds will be there. Mark McMillan's going to be there. Jeremy Cowart, Scott Erickson, lots of people. We've got, but it really is. We've got people coming together from all over the world, performance artists from Hong Kong, different parts of the States. And we just spend the weekend with times of worship, keynote talks, performances. We have an after party downtown with a DJ and drinks. It's a fun time all together. And so that's coming up in March. This will be our 7th one.
Wow.
And I'm really excited about this one for sure.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful.
The theme for this year is perception, how we see God, how we see one another. And so a lot of what we'll be talking about are some of the points that we talked about here today.
Oh, beautiful. Beautiful. Well, listen, if you're in the area or even if you're not in the area, hop on the plane, right?
That's right.
All right.
Follow it like you can do the Dead follow, right?
Yeah, just hey, there'll be a drum circle, right?
That's right. We'll do a drum circle.
Yeah. All right, Stephen, this is the last question. And this is the question we're just asking everyone this entire season number 2 on the Ferment. I'm very interested. What are you hoping for? Or what are you dreaming about?
That's really good. Oh, man. Well, it's interesting. I came into 2020 not so much with guns blazing, here's my new plan to take over the world, so much as I just want to be a faithful steward to what I've been given. And years ago, I owned a business that my wife and I ran, and we sold that business to pursue this creative arts adventure that we're doing now. And I set out a whole list of goals of things that I wanted to do. And a couple of those things involved building creative communities around the world, publishing another book, an e-course for some of the things that I've done. So really, I'm just in a place where I'm maintaining and trying to be a good steward of the things that I've already put in motion.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as what I want to see, I want to see the creative communities that are scattered all over this world, faith communities, creative communities, really come to understand how important that relationship between art and faith and culture is. And I hope to pioneer some new ways of looking at faith and the spiritual life without the religious trappings that normally are associated with that.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah. And just to sort of reflect off something you said there, I totally get what you're saying. I totally get that, because at a certain level, you give your yes to something and it's kind of a no to a million other things, isn't it? You give your you give your really big yes to something and you're like, well, this is I'm here to steward and to lean in. What else can I do? I've given my yes.
Yeah.
I love that. Well, hey, Stephen, before we press end on the record button here, I think it would be really sweet if you would maybe just give a little blessing to artists and creatives and dreamers and seekers. Could you maybe pray a little blessing or speak a little blessing over the people who are listening?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we'd love that.
I would be honored to do that. Yeah. So, Jesus, thank you so much for everyone listening to this, for everyone that's been inspired by this, for everyone that's had something wake up in their hearts through listening to these words, and for all those that have this resonating yes inside of them. I just say, be blessed, and you have permission to explore whatever crazy idea is erupting in your heart right now that doesn't have a prototype. And also, I just pray for my friends listening to this, that they would know and recognize that they aren't isolated and alone, but there is a community of people that think and feel and experience the same challenges and intimations of your presence that we're all talking about today. And so I just bless my friends listening to this, and I just pray that everyone listening to this would have that creative spark in their heart liberated and awakened, because the world needs your art. So keep creating. In the name of Jesus. Hallelujah.
Amen. That was great.
Yeah, man. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for coming on.
Appreciate you having me, man.
That's
we'll
right.
have you on Makers and Mystics.
Yeah, in this summer.
Sounds great.
All right, peace.
Hey everyone, Casey Coram here, producer of the Ferment Podcast. Thanks for listening. I just wanted to remind you about our Sing Together conference in Nashville, Tennessee from March 26th through 28th. It's going to be a great time and we hope to see you there. For more information, go to vineyardworship.com. All right, people. See you next time. Peace.